Jamie and company, are you ready?
Yes.
Yes, we are.
I'm going to kick the meeting off. Good afternoon.
Afternoon.
Thank you for coming. This is a meeting of the Chautauqua Lake and Protection and Rehabilitation Agency. This meeting is intended for a discussion between the agency members and our consultants who are joining us on Zoom tonight. So we've had a public meeting where the information was presented by the consultants, and the consultants have now received input from the public. This is an opportunity for the consultants to discuss with the agency members the three different funding options and the input that they've received. The intention is no decisions will be made tonight. This is an opportunity for the agency members to learn more about the input that's been received from the community, and then at our next meeting next month, we'll be looking for the agency members to make a decision as to which of the three funding options they would like the consultants to proceed with. So, with that, I'm going to turn the meeting over to Jamie Burchard, who's on screen in the upper right-hand corner. And Jamie, you can take us away.
Great. Thank you, Pierre, for the introduction. And yes, as just an overview, again, this will be probably the third time for many of the agency members hearing about this presentation. We had a committee workshop in October, and then we had our public meeting, which was on December 1st. So we introduced the information to the committee on October 20th, and then we essentially repeated that same presentation at a public information meeting on December the 1st. And then we essentially allowed there to be a space on the project website, in addition to feedback that we received at the public information meeting on the 1st. We've collected that information and then opened it up to the project website as well. So at this point, again, before we kind of provide that high-level overview of the funding options, with which Jack will be again providing a very brief overview, because again, that's the third time that we've talked about it. We also wanted to just hear in general from the agency members before we go into that overview, if anyone has any particular questions or comments based on the feedback as well, that you would like to present to us before we go into our overview.
Jamie,
Again, just open comments and questions.
Jamie, if I can just interrupt with one piece of housekeeping that Lauren would like me to point out, is that for the agency members, if you have a question or something, a comment to be made to the consultants, please speak into your microphone, because that's the only way that they're going to hear it.
Okay. I have a question. I've been thinking about this. Louise Ortman, North Harmony. I've been thinking about this for some time, and I may be missing something, but I'm thinking that we could solve a lot of the problems that we're going to be facing with each of these scenarios if we simply take the tax assessments as they currently stand, because they've already gone through with size of the property, whatever, number of bedrooms, distance to the lake, all the criteria that go into a tax assessment. If we took that assessment for all the affected people and we said, okay, tier one is going to pay this percentage of their tax, and maybe tier two is going to pay less of a percentage, and the rest of the watershed would pay less than that percentage. The formula is already there, and there's already buy-in. For the most part, people have bought into the formula used for their tax assessment, or if they haven't, they can challenge that and see what they can do about it. But every scenario is going to be fraught with challenge and disagreement, no matter how we slice it. But we have a formula already in place, and I don't understand why we don't use it. I've been wondering that for some time. What am I missing here?
So your question is in regards to how municipalities currently are assessing property taxes?
No. My question is, everybody that's going to contribute to the Lake District, Tier 1, Tier 2, the watershed, they all pay taxes. They already have assessments on their property based on that formula that's already been agreed to, or if they don't agree to it, they'll challenge it, but it's already in place. There's buy-in for it, or at least there's acceptance for it. Why don't we use the tax formula, the tax assessment, and assign a percentage of that? Tier 1 would be a certain percent, maybe Tier 2 would be less than Tier 1, and Tier 3 or the rest of the watershed would be a less percentage. They'd still be paying a percentage of their tax assessment based off a formula that's already been developed and is pretty broad spread accepted.
Jamie, I've got a couple thoughts here. If I'm understanding correctly, I think one valid point here is some of the data that's included within that formula as far as how the taxes are assessed. I think one important piece to note is one of the goals of the study being looking at what factors associated with each property are going to be the indicators of potential pollutant contributions. I do know we had thrown assessed value in as far as the formula-based fee approach as a potential piece that could be factored in, but the rest of the variables there may or may not be included within that portion, and the actual assessed value does not necessarily correlate directly to those pollutant contributions. So I think the simplest answer to the question is that I do see that as a very valuable way to save some implementation work as far as being able to pull some of the other factors that may be included within each one of these mechanisms. But as far as the goals of the funding mechanism being directly related to pollutant contributions, I don't know that it would be able to necessarily get the full picture, but certainly something that can be evaluated during later stages of this study after we've looked at these three mechanisms as far as is there any existing information that we can pull from there to make this a little bit more easily agreed upon or easier to implement.
The other question I had upon doing some more thinking about this is, okay, we said up front we need $4 million because that's how much it cost us in the last few years, is my understanding, to treat the lake and take care of the lake. So, okay, so what if we raised all the taxes for $4 million, for that amount? All the people in Chautauqua County are going to benefit from the lake. And I get that there's other lakes and other areas of need, but Chautauqua County pays for services in Dunkirk, services in Jamestown. They don't match service for service every place in the county. So without calling it a lake tax, get the whole tax amount of money that you tax all Chautauqua County residents, raise that by the $4 million that you need, and everybody, and spread it all around, all across that Chautauqua County tax base. It's not going to be a big hit for any one person, but it's going to give the county the funds they need, and then the county, as the county does run other agencies and other programs, the county then takes over and forms a lake district to oversee the management of it, like they do other entities within the county.
Sure, and Jamie, feel free to jump in here if you would like. I think the biggest consideration here is from the legal feasibility component that we've gone over during some of the previous meetings. As far as the existing regulations and what we have gathered to date, the county-wide tax is not legally
I'm not
implementable.
mentioning a county-wide tax per se. I'm saying take the total amount of taxes collected in Chautauqua County that are needed to run the county programs, add $4 million to it. Not calling it a Chautauqua Lake tax, just this is what we need to do business. And part of the business that we're doing is keeping the lake clean for all. just like the other businesses that the county does? That's my question.
Sure. And Jamie, Pierre, and Mark, I don't know if you have anything else to add. I guess the first piece I would
Pierre, was that
jump
clear?
into would be
Was
the
that
4
clear?
million piece. Now
Clear
the
enough?
overall funding amount is not established 100%. I know we have been looking at the 4 million as far as what has been used to date. A couple considerations there were one that it does still leave something to be desired as far as additional funds available and projects for the lake from a greater amount of funding. And another component is the being able to leverage for grant funding. The larger the total local share, the more opportunities for grant funding. And I think that's a very key piece as far as what that total funding amount is. Now, to your point, as far as being able to bump up the existing taxes, I think it's just a different approach and kind of the looking at it as the difference between a tax and sort of this user fee and this district that's kind of operated in a different method than a formal tax.
Jack, I think Steve Abdallah can help us with this.
Excellent.
Yeah, I think just going back to what the purpose of this agency is certainly to look at whether or not a district should be formed. And that's a question that the agency will answer. Should a district be formed, and if so, what should be its funding mechanism? I think what you're pointing out, Louise, is what certainly remains as another option is having funds for the purpose of addressing Chautauqua Lake raised through the annual county budget.
Exactly.
And, in that manner, they would be spread countywide through the tax levy. And in that scenario, there wouldn't be a necessity of a district. So that is another option certainly on the table.
But you would, even without a special district, we would need some management of that portion of the tax funds.
I mean, that could be a question. I mean, certainly most funds raised through the county budget are managed by the county department who
Well,
that
that's-
program
okay.
falls under, and under the
So
supervision.
we need a new department then.
That would be one scenario, or use an existing department.
Or an
And of course,
existing one, yeah.
The county executive and the county legislature have oversight over those departments.
Right.
Larry Anderson, Town of Ellery. How did we arrive at the $10 million figure?
The $10 million figure was selected for a few different reasons, as I mentioned. One was just to view it as that existing $4 million estimation as far as the annual spend, looking at how far that goes and just the understanding that a larger sum was going to be needed to accomplish all of the goals. Again, this is not a number that even at the culmination of this study that would be set in stone. That would be upon evaluation of these mechanisms selected later on during more an implementation phase. As far as landing on the 10 million, part of it was just for illustration purposes. It is a round number. It was in the ballpark of what we were looking for after evaluating different types of projects and what that spend would ultimately look like. So a few different reasons, but one of the important pieces being that is not necessarily a finalized number at this point.
So we're going to vote on setting up a tax district possibly and not knowing the final number that we need to raise.
At
So I
this
just
point,
want
go ahead,
to get
Jenny.
out a reminder of kind of the spirit of what this study is about. It's a feasibility study, and we are here to collect information and research the menu of options where we started back in the summer and moving forward to where we are now with looking at potential taxing options. The direction, as we just mentioned, the spirit of the formation of the agency is to look at a feasibility study to understand if there is a recommendation to the county legislature if a district should be formed based on the information in this feasibility study. So I think, again, we're trying, there's lots of variables and lots of options. And what this report is trying to do is pare down that information so that we can decide, or the county can decide, the county legislature can decide if that's the direction to move in. It may not be. This is just a feasibility study to think about it in that way. So again, the 10 million is not a scientific number. It's looking at what the cost analysis is in terms of the current spend for in-lake and watershed projects, establishing that kind of baseline, and then thinking big picture broadly across, a large wish list of what could we accomplish if we were to collect more in this, again, feasibility study. And so the 10 million was a good place to start the conversation, to think about, different projects that are currently not being done right now in the watershed and in the lake, such as dredging projects. So I think, again, I just want to advise agency members to think about the data and the collection and the research that we're putting forward, because again, the spirit of this report really is to help with a direction for movement, because at the end, maybe it's decided that there is no recommendation to move forward. It's just really a research and data collection study. And I don't know if Jack or Dave had any other thoughts to kind of put towards that.
Yeah, I agree. And another important piece is just the fact that with all these different variables, a lot of resources would be needed to fully evaluate what that would look like, what other data would be needed, how would this be implemented. And so the ultimate recommendation that will be voted on is not something that is going to be moved forward with, but it is just what everybody feels. This seems like the most likely candidate to have resources put to establish some of those final questions as far as what is the total spend, how is that broken out, how are we implementing. This is more just finding that mechanism that seems like it's going to be the preferred one to start to iron out all of those details and be able to avoid the legwork of the smaller details for each different mechanism that we're looking at.
Jamie, this is Pierre, and understanding that Larry is brand new on the Lake Agency, it might be helpful to again review the process that we are engaged in. So the Lake Protection and Rehabilitation Agency, its purpose is to make a recommendation to the legislature, as Steve Abdallah said, if a lake district should be formed. So the consultant's report will be presented to the agency members to consider in their deliberations as to what their recommendation is going to be to the legislature. So once the consultant's report is finalized, it'll be presented to the agency members. The agency members will then deliberate and make a decision as to their recommendation to the legislature, which will be a district should be formed or a district should not be formed. Then the legislature will further deliberate and decide if they want to proceed with forming a district or not, if it is recommended by the agency. We clear? Thank you, Jamie.
You're welcome.
Steve, you want to clarify what I just said?
No, I just want to add to it that district's recommended, if the agency were to recommend formation of a district, that should include a recommended funding formula, should include should be the recommended initial annual expenditures of that new district, and also then the boundaries and the tiers, if there are tiers, of the district.
Thank you. Back to you, Jamie.
Okay. So just again, for the sake of discussion, because we do want to have, more of this back and forth, this is meant to be a working session because we'll come back in January and make a decision by the agency members for our team to know the direction of the report to continue moving forward on. So we really want to use tonight's, time together to have a conversation and discussion around table. So this is all good information and good back and forth conversation. So if there aren't any more general observations or comments, we can just very broadly review those three options and then come back to a working session discussion.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Excellent. And Jamie, I will hop right into that if you are ready. Everybody got the PowerPoint showing there? So as we mentioned, there are three funding mechanisms that are still in evaluation here, and I will move fairly quickly through these as we've gone through them a few times, but we just wanted to make sure that everything was fresh in everybody's minds as we get to the discussion in comparison between these three. And so feel free if there are any specific questions as to how these individual tiers work to go ahead and throw those out as we are walking through them, and then we can get back to kind of the general discussion and thoughts. So the three mechanisms that we are looking at are the tiered flat fee, the equivalent residential unit, and a formula-based fee. Again, just as a reminder, as we have mentioned in the previous presentation, that these are all the figures at this point, generally illustrative. We have used existing data, but this has not been refined to the point as far as final numbers, and there will be a little skew here and there with that. So the most basic of the three mechanisms that we are looking at is the tiered flat fee, and this is just taking the total funding goal, again subject to change between tiers, looking at the total number of parcels and then just taking an equal division between those parcels as far as what the uniform fee within that tier would look like. This is not going to look at the size or the land use of a parcel. As with the others, I will just state up front again that the report will evaluate what different exemptions may look like, what different incentives there may be to be able to reduce your fee with different best management practices. But in its essence, this is just a straight division of that total funding goal amongst tier between each one of those parcels. And again, depending on which tier the funding goal is coming from, would depend on whether those funds are eligible for in-lake use or projects throughout the watershed, and a few of those other details to be ironed out. The second piece that we looked at, the second mechanism, is a formula-based fee, and this one does account for some of the variability between different parcels. Of the three mechanisms that we have looked at, this is the one that can be tailored to the most different variables. We have, in general, been assessing these based off of variables that scientifically are looked at as being drivers of non-point source or runoff pollution and ultimately pollutant loading that can enter the lake. And so these are things such as the size, the land use that are not captured within that tiered flat fee. And as far as just a real quick example, we would take the base contribution that even split between tiers, and then we would adjust for a number of selected variables that we have. Again, these scores that we have here are just illustrative, but in essence, we would take that base contribution. These scores would all be related around 1. If a certain variable has a score of less than 1, that would be reducing that base contribution. If it has a score of greater than 1, then when multiplied by that base contribution, it would elevate it slightly. One of the pros, as I mentioned, of this is that it can bring in a little bit more of a mix and match feature as far as the variables. Some of the different cons as far as this, really the main one is with each different variable that is brought in, you are adding another level of complexity as far as what needs to be reevaluated over time. And then you do have the difference of agreement based off of who feels what factors should be weighted more highly. And for just a quick example, if we have with our illustrative scores here, if we had a parcel in tier 1 at 1.3 acres, we would take the base contribution of $793. We would take the land use score of 1 and the area score of 1.1. We would multiply those, and then that would elevate because we have the 1 multiplier, and then we have one slightly greater than 1. Does anybody have any basic questions as far as clarity as to how this one works before I move on to the equivalent residential unit? All right, and we can certainly return back to this if questions pop up during the discussion later on. The third and final mechanism that we have been evaluating is the equivalent residential unit, and this one is based around one single variable, so it will still account for the amount of development on a site, and it will still account for variability between parcels. But the one variable that the ERU method looks at is the amount of developed impervious cover on a parcel. And the reason that is so important is that it is going to limit infiltration of water onto the site. It is going to speed up the rate of water flowing across the site and potentially allow for greater pollutant contributions. And as far as the example goes here, the first step is always going to be determining the average impervious cover for a residential property. The whole essence of this mechanism, which is one that has been used throughout most of the case studies that we have evaluated, is to figure out your average residential parcel, how much impervious developed cover from a square footage standpoint does one residential property total. And then throughout the ERU formula, it allows to relate any other property type and size that is not residential to that same amount of impervious cover. And so step one, after you have determined that average impervious cover, you're going to take that total impervious cover and figure out how many ERUs are in the watershed, with one ERU being that square footage for the average residential property. Once you have determined the cost of one ERU and you take your total funding goal, you can figure out the cost associated with each ERU. And so I will walk through an example to illustrate this here. So we have tier 1 estimated to include approximately just shy of 9 million square feet of impervious cover based off of our preliminary data. We estimated, based off of the total number of residential properties and the total estimated impervious cover made up by those, as well as from some general case studies and accepted values, that we used a value of 2,000 square feet of impervious cover for one residential property. That is going to represent one ERU. And if we take the total impervious cover within tier 1 and we divide it by that 2,000 square feet, we determine there are just short of 4,400 ERUs in tier 1. Based off of the illustrative funding goal, if we take those 43 and change hundred ERUs and we divide that by 2 million, we determine that one ERU is $458. So through this formula, we were able to determine that your average residential property, that would be their contribution, and any non-residential property with 2,000 square feet of impervious cover, that would be their contribution. Next, you get into how you can relate this to other property types. So, for example, we took a commercial property that includes 6,000 square feet of impervious cover. We had already established that one equivalent residential unit is 2,000 square feet. So that means that this commercial property includes 3 equivalent residential units. Based off of the price of $458 per equivalent residential unit, or per 2,000 square feet of impervious cover, this commercial property would then contribute $1,374. Again, similar to the formula-based fee, there would be the potential for a cap system to limit the total contribution. There would be the potential for incentives to reduce how much of your developed property is evaluated in that total. And there would be the potential for exemptions for certain land uses, but those would be, again, evaluated if this were to be seen as the preferred method. One of the primary pros of this is just its history as being used in these type of districts. And really the other pro of this is the fact that there is only one variable that needs to be reassessed over time. One of the negatives of this as compared to the formula-based fee is the fact that we are only looking at one variable. You do need to end up with some agreement as far as that being the primary variable that should be looked at. The final benefit of this is the fact that this will always be related around that funding total, and it takes a lot less changing of scoring values to make sure that we end up at that final value, which is something that the formula-based fee needs a little bit more tailoring through those scores. So I know that was a quick run through of each of these pieces here. We do have the pros and cons table that we can revisit if we need later, but I think unless there are any specific questions as to how the ERU is calculated and how that mechanism works, then I will kick it back to Jamie and we can get into some more general discussion. So before I do that, would anybody like to discuss how the ERU method works or what goes into it?
Yeah, I've got a question. Has this been done anywhere else in New York State? Or has it been done anywhere else in the U.S.?
Yes, it has been. The primary one in New York State that we have been looking at is the city of Ithaca has implemented this for their stormwater district. South Burlington, Vermont is another one that has done this, and there have been a number of others. This definitely seems to be the front runner as far as existing districts, what has been selected for their use in determining contributions.
And those two examples are just ones that we've been looking at specific case studies because there's a lot of information for. But there's a lot of literature through the U.S. EPA that talks about the ERU method as a stormwater utility. And that method has been used by more than 80% of all stormwater utilities, the ERU. So there is quite a bit of evidence across the country for this approach to be utilized.
So how does this enter in, say, the village of Lakewood with several culverts running into the lake from the mall, some of the other shopping plazas? How would that enter into this mechanism?
Well, the final discharge point would not be how this is evaluated. This would be based strictly off of the ownership of those parcels. So for each of those commercial plazas, whoever is responsible for the fees associated with that land and the ownership of that land, it would be based around just specifically what's located on that property, and similar to the others is evaluated on a property by property basis based off of what is the amount of rooftop, driveway, these other kind of hard developed surfaces located on each parcel.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And these are good questions. This is definitely the type of information such as, parcel data, user data, which will all need to be collected and sifted through and vetted. That's not where we are at in the process. Again, we are here to look at a finite number of potential mechanisms and make a recommendation in the report for which one to explore further. And then the next stage would be to, if that's the direction that we want to go in, to explore that more resources will need to be dedicated to, okay, now let's get the data and sift through it and see what that looks like. So just a reminder that we're not looking at the data per se right now and vetting it. It's more of the recommendation of the approach. And we can talk more about the pros and cons too, because I think that's part of what will help the agency members come back in January to give our team a direction to continue moving forward in the report to flesh it out even further.
Hi, this is Toby Shepard from Chautauqua Institution. It seems like one of the things that we all have an interest in is incentivizing the right behavior. Given that ERUs have been used, I think you said 80% of the examples maybe from the EPA, and you've listed two, one in Ithaca and one in Burlington. Do we have any knowledge of Like, has that incentivized the right behavior? Do we have any feedback on how those systems or those districts are performing?
We do, and Dave, feel free if you would prefer to field this, but
Yeah, I can provide some general comment here. Most municipalities that have implemented ERUs have put in some sort of incentive program. So if a homeowner or a shop owner were to depave or put in some best management practices, some green infrastructure, stormwater practices, there is an incentive to either reduce your ERUs or to get a credit built into the programs. However, primarily with our discussions with the city of Ithaca, most folks have not pursued those incentives yet. It's still a relatively new program in Ithaca, but they haven't had homeowners or developers really capitalize on seeking those incentives or credits.
And I guess you haven't looked at Burlington or any other community, just Ithaca is the only one you've looked at?
That's the one that we've had the most direct contact with. We have looked at Burlington, and we can get some more information as far as how many folks have utilized the incentives.
It just seems like I'm going to say what I already said, but as we're trying to consider the most effective, method to recommend, if we've got, a strong point for the ERUs, it seems like we have some runways, we have some examples of those being in place, and if we got feedback on how they're working, we'd be in a better position to, evaluate that.
Yep, we can certainly look for more information on that.
Thanks.
Yeah, and there's some good there is a lot of literature out there. As a matter of fact, in New York State, there's a lot of model local laws for resilience, for whether it be just general resilience, right? So stormwater management is part of that kind of one of those sectors for responding to changes in climate. And so there's a suite of local laws, and one of them is for stormwater management and looking at stormwater utilities as a type of long-term funding mechanism to help incentivize property owners to help with creating more resilience in their built environment by reducing the amount of impervious cover. And so there's some good literature there that we can start compiling and putting together, maybe like a literature debrief that we can compile and send out to agency members. So I think that's an excellent suggestion.
Yeah, and just to build upon that, to Toby's point, I think a lot of this comes back to public education and outreach, and you really need to get that message across to the community as to how their actions and impacts affect stormwater, and how their improvements and benefits to stormwater can help lessen any fees that may be imposed by a district.
Yeah, I kind of want to pick up on that too, because something that I thought I heard it said earlier is the advantage of the ERU is that you're not that the total funding stays the same. I guess I just wanted to have this discussion with everybody here. If property owners, if we're incentivizing them, if the agency is incentivizing them to do the right thing, they're reducing the runoff from their property into the lake. If we actually collected a lower fee based on those, based on people improving their properties, wouldn't that be a good thing? Like, in other words, maybe it's a different way of asking the same question is, if we started out with a $10 million goal, but people responded to the incentives that we laid out in front of them, and we only ended up collecting $8 million because of that, well, the watershed is, the lake, the whole system is reaping the benefits of those improvements. So I guess I just wanted to pose the question, like, isn't that what we want?
Yes, that's a great point, and I should clarify what I had mentioned earlier as far as the benefit of the ERU system being able to keep that consistent funding goal. What I mean there is that it will always provide the total funding goal based off of how the formula is set up, because there is not this development of this scoring matrix that the formula-based fee has. So there would be absolutely the potential, if those incentives were implemented and were followed. If the decision, with the oversight group was that we are able to start reducing that total fee, that could certainly work. And then that new reduced fee could be plugged into the ERU formula, and the formula would always yield 100% of that. The point that I had misspoken or needed to clarify on between the formula and the ERU approach is just the benefit that to achieve that total funding goal, whether that is 10 million or reduced on an annual basis based off of incentives, the formula will always provide the full goal that is plugged into it. Where that formula approach really needs to be tailored, anytime a score for one land use went up based off of higher contributions, another one would need to go down, and that would need to factor in the total acreage and number of those parcels to make sure that it's yielding that target goal, whatever it is. So that is absolutely a fair point that incentives could reduce, but none of these approaches would limit that as an option.
Great. Thanks, Jack. That clarification helps.
Yep, thank you.
I guess we're just in general discussion now, so I'll keep going. One other question I had, sort of more broadly among all the different funding methodologies, and we were talking about Village of Lakewood earlier, and I know the village did some stormwater, improved the runoff on their streets. Just as an example, if a property owner has done something to improve stormwater management before today, let's say if today's day zero, which I know it's not, but if something's happened in the past, do you including that in the assessment of their property? Have you seen examples of that, or could you just comment on that as far as the feasibility of that?
Yeah, I think that is another great point. As far as being able to retroactively go in and factor in previous improvements made that are going to help mimic natural hydrology on a property.
Yeah.
And as far as the design of those different components, including the streetscapes in Lakewood, there are New York State DEC designated formulas as far as if you were to go and be developing new property and you were going to incorporate some of those, it's going to allow you to reduce the amount of impervious area that is viewed on that site based off of those standard calculations. And I think that's something that absolutely warrants being looked at in this report and on that incentive piece. Dave, I don't know if you have anything additional to add, but I do think there are plenty of standardized methods that would do us well to evaluate as far as, the potential that would have for any of these.
Yeah, I think, under either approach, whether it was the formula or the ERU, if a homeowner, were to put in practices, a permeable driveway, for example, or a green roof, for example, that would back out the impervious calculations, which would affect, their fee, whether it was based on the formula approach or the ERU approach.
And I think the same would go for really the contributing drainage area for anything that was deemed as an eligible green infrastructure practice. Whatever impervious surfaces are being treated by those features, would likely be eligible to be backed out of that property's total. So we'll definitely make a note to explore that in the report.
So how do you tier the Village of Lakewood? How do you tier the Village of Bemis Point? How do you tier Chautauqua Institution?
As far as the tiers themselves, it is all based around lake access. It is something that we have what seems to be pretty concrete data, but would absolutely need to be vetted during implementation and make sure that what we have in our preliminary tiers here for the feasibility study, those that we are showing as having direct lake access and lakefront property, confirming that they do. But the tier approach would not necessarily be related to municipality so much as lake access, with tier 1 is those that have lake frontage on the property. Tier 2 have some level of private access to the lake. And tier 3 are those that would need to use public access or are just located within the greater Chautauqua Lake watershed, but do not necessarily have those benefits as far as direct private access. So for each municipality, those would, as far as how we have this set up at the moment, that is how they would fall into each tier.
Jack, it might be helpful for the group if we could pull up the map and just share again the
Sure.
statistics with the number of parcels that fall within each of the 3 tiers.
Yep. I'm just tracking over to that slide quickly.
And as a reminder, the reason we have the tiers is to, again, demonstrate the benefits. So the tier 1 and 2 would be the direct benefit that the lake provides to those parcels, and what type of implementation projects would be conferred to those property owners, which would be in lake. And then the tier 3 would be more at that watershed level, and to match the benefit that would be received to those property owners for watershed projects. So that is the reason why we have the 3 tiers and the different in-lake versus watershed projects, and what that total spend and how it would be used based on your situation, the property owner situation in the tier.
Here's just the couple figures to give a little bit more clarity as far as the color schemes associated with the bright green being those parcels that do have direct frontage. Those other periphery ones right around the lake but that do not have frontage being tier 2, and tier 3 being those outside that do not have any direct access themselves.
So it's another way to think about it too is, I know that obviously it's always a challenge in New York State to think regionally, but that's what this is, right? It's an intermunicipal type of approach. And that's why we are exploring the county 5A and understanding the legal feasibility of being able to set it up through that existing mechanism. And I think where we need to go as a team, once we understand what direction the agency members will provide to us, that will help us flesh out the report to help connect how the total funding ask can connect to those projects and what those projects can be. That's going to help, this information is going to help us move forward in that report. And again, as Jack had mentioned, we're not here vetting the data. We're here exploring the funding mechanisms and using the data that is current, but that would have to come next, is understanding that the data, of confirming and vetting the data, which is the implementation component.
Could you go back to that map?
Absolutely.
Question on, is the whole lake down to the dam? Like, I'd always understood that was the watershed, but it didn't. I just wonder how much of it we're considering.
Yep. So that is something that is still, one of the final decisions that would need to be made. We have pulled the data for both the boundary that you see here, as well as what you're referring to, including more of Jamestown down to the dam. The decision that we needed to make up front, as far as selection of the boundary, we had decided to stick with the Chautauqua Lake Watershed Management Plan boundary. But that ultimately would need to be, one of the final decisions as far as who is included and who is not. So we have pulled the parcels in both of those boundaries, able to be plugged into either one of these formulas and the spreadsheets that we have going. But ultimately, we had decided for the illustration of how these mechanisms work, just to keep that boundary consistent with the previous plan.
Yeah, and you can see with the inset map on the bottom left of the screen there, that could pull it to the dam.
Right. Okay, but right now we're basing it off of what was used in the watershed management plan. Right. Thanks.
Yes.
This is a more general question or just a different topic. I know both in previous sessions and in my conversations with folks and in looking at the feedback we got on the website, there's a good, decent amount of interest in user fees. My understanding from previous meetings is that we don't have a ruling or judgment or whatever the right term is from the state on whether those are allowed. Am I right in that? And I know, like, Jamie, you've made the point clearly that, like, we're not, we're trying to assess these methodologies, which we'll need to do regardless. I'm just trying to consider if we have X number of dollars to raise and there's different ways of getting to that number, with these three recommendations being one of those ways, I'm just trying to figure out what the feasibility of other ways of raising those funds are.
Jamie, I'll take that one, and
thanks.
maybe with some assistance from Steve, but the imposition of boat fees would require state approval.
Right, okay.
Our state elected officials are interested in helping with that. They would be much more interested in helping with that if that were a component of the funding for the Lake District. Not to say that they wouldn't support it otherwise, but if that were a component of the funding for the Lake District, they would be much more interested in that approach. And that would certainly then be a contribution to the funding for the lake protection and rehabilitation, which would potentially reduce the amount of funding that's required from the parcels in the watershed.
Right.
And members of this agency, since we started this agency, have consistently expressed interest in doing that, pursuing boat fees.
Got it. Thanks, Peter.
And I think one of the issues for our team in helping to plug it into the funding mechanism is that there's not consistent data or it's not actively being collected. Boats entering the lake, it's very inconsistent. And so if that, we're treating it as kind of, if we're building, a sundae, right? The ice cream is going to be this taxing district, and the whipped cream and the cherry is going to be the boat user fee, essentially. It's going to be extra. It's not going to be the foundation of moving forward for the big picture. It's not going to present the biggest amount of collection of available funds to move forward and basically attain the types of, again, the large big picture implementation projects that we want to see for the in-lake, maintenance and dredging and things of that nature. So it's certainly something that we're considering in the report, and we'll look to make a recommendation for, which may also include a way to kind of, again, since it's a feasibility study, to make a recommendation for there to be some sort of beginnings of data collection, of figuring out how boats are entering, how many boats are entering the lake, and the ownership of those fee, the entry points, and how will that be administered. There's lots of examples out there, but again, I think our team is kind of coming at it that it's kind of and as Pierre has introduced the material, it's supplementary to what this funding mechanism can be.
Thank you.
Jamie, were you planning to discuss the feedback that has been received from the public?
Yes, well, as I'm sure agency members have read through, there's quite a few comments coming through in terms of, and on the project website, we sent the information out last week. We've got 40 comments on the project website about the tiered flat fee, 28 comments received on the formula-based fee funding option, and 25 for the ERU. And then just some general comments, about 31 about, again, comments on the December 1st presentation. I think from what I can read consistently amongst the feedback, one of the ways to kind of, again, I've mentioned this earlier in the presentation, but it's really, we're at the point now where I think there's a lot of comments and questions on implementation and administration. And we're here to look at a finite number of possible mechanisms for the agency members to make a recommendation to the county ledge. And then from there will be extra work that needs to be done to even move forward. Again, the data is going to have to be looked at more closely. So I would just, I guess the way I approach most of the comments and the questions that I've read is that they're all excellent, good thoughts that are put forward. But I just want to caution is that we're, as a team, we're not there. This again is just a place to start the conversation and to start getting some groundwork moving forward so that more resources can be dedicated to fleshing this out more if this is going to be a plausible way to move forward. And I think in general, that's kind of how I've interpreted the comments and questions that have been received to date. I don't know if there's any in particular that folks want to talk about or ask in particular.
Well, Jamie, one of the very good questions that I received was regarding what the city of Syracuse has done with their stormwater management in terms of an approach called Save the Rain. And I understand that Dave has some personal experience with that, so it might be illustrative for Dave to talk about that approach for a minute.
Sure. So the way the Save the Rain program came about, initially the Syracuse had a consent order from the EPA due to combined sewer discharges to Onondaga Lake. And years ago, the city of Syracuse was going to build regional treatment facilities. So there were going to be 3 or 4 treatment facilities that were going to treat stormwater separately from wastewater. That was an approved approach, and then there was some changes with the county administration, and they relooked at things and they renegotiated the consent order with the United States EPA to implement this Save the Rain program. And the Save the Rain program is basically focused on implementing green infrastructure practices. So a lot of it has to deal with converting former parking lots to porous pavement, providing incentives to landowners to put in rain barrels, to put in other green infrastructure practices. And it was really a holistic shift by the city of Syracuse and Onondaga County to go away from treating stormwater from these regional treatment facilities to managing it at the source, which is what kind of the goal of green infrastructure is, to again reduce the amount of impervious area and let rainwater soak into the ground, infiltrate into the ground prior to getting into the lake. And the whole purpose of the county's program is, again, because the city of Syracuse has combined sewers. So the sewer system handles wastewater, domestic wastewater, but during heavy storm flows, they get overwhelmed. So the city of Syracuse had raw sewage going into Onondaga Lake. So the purpose of the green infrastructure and the Save the Rain program is to limit the amount of water that goes into the combined sewer to, again, infiltrate it at the source and prevent it from getting into the storm sewer system in the first place.
Thank you, Dave. I was thinking back to the question that was asked earlier about the experience that Ithaca and Burlington have had with their incentive programs. I think what Syracuse has done has been an incentive program on steroids, it sounds like. So perhaps
Yes.
you could get some input from them as to their success with implementing incentive programs.
Yes, and we've got a lot of contacts there. We could, likely bring in someone to present specifically on that program.
That'd be great. This is just bringing up another thought in my head. Like, incentivizing the right behavior is certainly important, but also not incentivizing the wrong behavior is just as important. And when we were looking at the different factorings for different land cover, I think I saw, and I know I saw it because you've shown it several times. Let's say something like a forest, which might be the best land cover for absorbing rainwater, has a 0.75 loading factor, which is better than 1 for that whoever that property owner is. I'm just trying to think, what we don't want to do is incentivize the wrong behavior, i.e. I own 10 acres of forest right on Chautauqua Lake. I don't, but let's just say I did. And because I'm going to face an extra fee, now I want to sell it. And
To the complication of the formula approach, where it takes a ton of poring over data and figuring out how many parcels are associated with each of these, and because any change to any one of those factors is going to drastically change that total contribution value you're going to end up at. Eventually, until we start to get to a point to determine, is this one that is going to be preferred, we're not the time and resources to be able to both get those scoring values where they should be, and also make sure that we're showing a total contribution value on par with those other two approaches. So that would be, in later stages, something that would be one of the main legwork factors, other than just getting that data, would be establishing that scoring matrix and really any exemptions that would go along with it.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's one of the challenges with the formula, as we've mentioned, is that there could be so much discussion on how you weight the different variables, what variables you use. And, the 0.75, again, was just for illustration purposes. But, certainly you could make the case that if you have a forested area or a conservation area, that it gets a weight of 0 for that variable. And that would in turn be a complete credit, and no fee associated with that.
Right.
So a lot of different nuances go into that formula approach.
Okay, Jamie, how are we doing?
We're doing well. I was just going to say we're at 6 o'clock, and I know we've got maybe another 30. Thinking as we move forward, since we're starting to talk about it now, if it would be helpful for the agency members to hear from our team what our professional opinion would be as you move forward and make your opinion or your decision at the January meeting.
We're getting some thumbs up.
Okay, great. All right, so we can move into that segue. I think, so yeah, based off what Dave and Jack just mentioned about some of the challenges with the formula, our team is definitely feeling more confident, again, with the number of precedent and case studies that are there. What we've found in our research and conversations with municipalities that are implementing that fee structure would be the ERU method. And again, I'll let maybe Jack talk a little bit more about his professional opinion and how he's gone through, the different mechanisms as well, and his thoughts on the ERU too.
Sure. Yeah, I think to Jamie's point, the precedence piece is a large component of it, as it is something, ultimately going through different levels of approval. That is certainly something that should be considered, but really it's that extra level of complexity, in my opinion, as far as putting together these preliminary numbers, trying to get the numbers to match up and seeing how much troubleshooting and data processing is involved in each. with each variable that is pulled into that formula approach, it is one extra level of data that needs to make sure that we are finding at a very high resolution, but not only finding at a high resolution, needing to vet that data and making sure that although it is very detailed data, is it 100% accurate, and how much time is needed over a period of 1, 2, 5, 10 years on an annual basis needs to go into reevaluating, how has land use changed? How has parcel size changed? Where the one thing that, beside the precedents that myself and I think all of us have found attractive about the equivalent residential unit option is that there is only one variable to track down. Now, that is not to say that, there would not still need to be some digging and some vetting, making sure that we know how developed each parcel is. It does give us only one variable up front that needs to be determined and needs to be reevaluated over time. And the benefit of it also is that it is the variable that, as far as all of these EPA and New York State DEC resources, and as far as these different case studies, that quantity of impervious development, it really is seen as the biggest driver of pollutant loading. So it's keeping it simple and keeping it with the variable that, in our opinion, is going to matter the most. And Dave, I don't know if you have anything else you'd like to add.
No, I would concur with all that. And, even to bring it back to the Save the Rain program again, the purpose of the Save the Rain program is to reduce impervious area and promote infiltration and to utilize green infrastructure. And, as Jack mentioned, the ERU is a bit complicated to explain. It takes, I think, really takes seeing the examples a couple times to understand it. But once you do understand it and realize that it's really solely based on impervious area, and that's really the biggest driver for non-source stormwater pollution and nutrient loading to the lake. I think it's probably the most attractive option, not only in the short term to implement, but really to maintain, to have a sustainable funding approach.
I think it's the easiest to incentivize there as well, Dave, to your point, as far as wanting to reduce that impervious cover. It kind of takes out the factor of consequences for not, and really just incentivizing to improve and treat things at the source.
I think there's a lot of benefit to behavior change because there are things that property owners can do to their property. The other factors that would go into the formula-based approach, there may not be that ability to conduct that behavior change. So it's something that an individual can actually, have a direct correlation to making that change and incentivizing it and making it, rewarding best practices for that particular feature.
I think one final piece I would add is just from the equity standpoint, with that sort of being the whole theme of this study and trying to figure out what both is going to work, but is what's agreeable and going to be fair to everybody. Well, the formula approach does allow to have a lot of voices heard and bring in the different components that are important to different people. The ERU is really going to allow for different property types to be apples to apples. And that's the one thing that approach does that these other do not. If you have a commercial property that development wise is the exact equivalent of 3 residential properties, then they pay 3 times as more as your average residence. And I think it's really the easiest way to be comparing different property types, and ultimately why in our case studies has been